Our theme this month is attention, and I'm reminded of the ways that Unitarian Universalist seminarians are taught to pay attention. And every aspiring Unitarian Universalist minister is required to go through at least one session of clinical pastoral education, also known as CPE. And this is a chaplain boot camp that usually takes place in a hospital, although it can happen other places. And here's where aspiring ministers do a combination of meeting with actual patients and then reflecting on those visits in a highly structured way with a group of other future clergy plus a supervisor. It's very intense. It's a rocket ship of ministerial formation. In fact, a classmate of mine from seminary, her first day of CPE, she lasted one day and she threw her ID in the garbage as she rushed out the door of the hospital. The story has a happy ending though. She's actually now working as a chaplain. So this path to ministry, it's a crooked one. Can I get an amen from ministers in the room? Yeah. Ooh, man. So in my first unit of chaplain training, my supervisor was a spiritual light named Sister Maureen, and she was a sister of mercy. And she started our months together as a group in a radical way. So the 7 of us were gathered in a circle on one of our first mornings, and she said that today, we would tell each other our stories. And we would do that by taking turns, and each of us was allowed to take as long as we needed to tell our story. And by as long as we needed, she meant as long as we wanted, with no limits and no timekeeper. And man, I was horrified. I thought, this is gonna be awful, having to listen to these folks and their endless blah, blah, blah. It's early in seminary, folks. I was a less generous person, I think. I was wrong about that. My classmates, they did sometimes take a couple hours to tell their whole stories, but they said what they needed to say, and I never felt like they were wasting my time. And when my turn came, I realized what a profound gift it was to be given permission to tell my story without feeling rushed, without explicitly or tacitly being told that I had to hurry up, I was wasting people's time. And the message was, my story was important, and that I was important, and it made me feel valued in a fundamental way. That helped me understand the power of being listened to. Being listened to in that way changed me, but over the course of my chaplain training, I came to realize how learning to become a listener was also profoundly transformative. This intentional practice of listening, it changed me also, and I'd like to share some of the ways that I was changed. So new chaplains are taught the basics for learning how to listen. Folks in this sanctuary, especially those who are in professions that call for listening, those folks are probably already aware of these rules. The other day, in fact, I facilitated a deep listening session with the Wisdom Circle. I saw some of the folks who were here today. And it was clear that folks there had a lot of prior practice doing deep listening with that style of encountering each other. So I laid out the principles in that session of the Quaker theologian Parker Palmer, and these are the ones that he uses in his circles of trust. And they will probably sound familiar to you. So as we listen, there is no fixing. That is, no solving, no trying to solve someone's problem for them. As we listen, there is no saving. That is, no taking on someone's problem as if it is our own. There is no advising. What's the worst kind of advice? Unsolicited advice. Never good. And I'll add a rule for listening of my own. There is no waiting until the person is finished speaking to jump in with one's, well, I have a story about that. None of that, please. And you'll notice a common theme in all these rules. They move the focus from the listener to the speaker, from the listener to the speaker. The listener puts aside their egos, their agendas, and their needs, and they simply are a witness to the speaker, a companion, perhaps. Now, I'm as self-involved as anybody, and there are times when that simply being present for someone, that's really hard for me. But the more I do it, the easier it gets, and in place of my self-absorption comes something really wonderful, a genuine sense of connection. Now, setting aside my agenda when I'm listening doesn't mean that I'm not paying attention to what's going on inside me. In fact, some of the process of listening well is also about cultivating self-awareness. Watching myself to see how I'm reacting to what's being said to me helps me listen better. So let me share a story from my chaplain days. I was once called to a room by a nurse supervisor, and the patient was a man. He was in his 70s. He was in for heart problems, and he had just decided to sign himself out of the hospital. And the medical term is AMA, against medical advice. And his family was there, and according to the nurse, they had talked him into leaving. And I think the nurse hoped that I would get them to reconsider, since he was very seriously ill, and his decision might actually kill him. His family was in the room when I walked in. After I spoke with them a while, I realized what was going on. The family practiced a kind of fundamentalist religion where they believed that they should place their father's care in God's hands rather than using the hospital. So as a chaplain, I'm not there to change people's theologies. That's not something we never ever do. What I'm there to do is to help folks find their own spiritual tools for resilience using what they have. So I bit my agnostic tongue, and I said that I hope it worked out for them. But then the patient's daughter, a grown woman, she turned the tables on me. She asked me my denomination, Unitarian Universalist. Of course, she'd never heard of it. And then she began to pepper me with questions. Was I really a follower of Jesus? Had I accepted him as my Savior? And I tried to steer the conversation away, try to take the focus off my beliefs, but the woman was relentless. She told me that my eternal soul was at stake, and that I needed to take Jesus in my heart. I wished them all well, and I left. Problem was, I left that room because I was angry, not because the visit was over. And I didn't realize until I left how angry I was. I was furious. I was not self-aware in that moment, and that meant that I wasn't listening. I'd like to take a moment for us to do a little practicum here. We're going to practice watching how we react when we're listening. So with your indulgence, I'm going to say 3 words, one at a time, and I invite you to just watch yourself. After each word or phrase, consider the way that your body or your mind may have automatically reacted to that word. Did it feel good or bad? Where did you feel a sensation? Was it in your stomach or in your neck or somewhere else? Did a rush of thoughts automatically start in your mind, unrequested and hard to stop? So take your time and watch. Are you ready? Here's the first word. Mother. How did that feel? The second word, Ukraine. Our final word, wildflowers. Did any of that surprise you? When we see how we're reacting, it helps us to separate what's going on in ourselves from what's going on in the person we're listening to. And that helps us more deeply understand that person without confusing their experience for ours. Watching how we react when we listen is important, and there's also an essential variation on this idea to think about. We who would be listeners, we need to understand the expectations that we bring into a conversation before the first word is even said. These are kind of like pre-reactions. When I was a chaplain, I had to constantly fight my habits of prejudging patients or rushing to a conclusion about what their spiritual need was in that moment. The life of a hospital chaplain is very repetitious. Every morning, I got a list of names. I saw patients in the same rooms every day, oftentimes with the same conditions. In my small community hospital that I served in Buffalo, I started to see the same kind of folks every day. Mostly they were elderly, white, Polish, Catholic, and working class. I had months of this. And it was so easy for me to assume that I'd know where the conversation was going. But the truth was, the patient visits where I showed up with no expectations and no agenda, those were the ones that were most powerful and most effective. A friend of mine recently completed chaplaincy training in a Buddhist tradition, and she talked to me about the 3 principles that she was told to bring into every interaction. The first principle is not knowing. That is, showing up without preconceptions. The second is bearing witness. That is the practice of not avoiding the truth in front of us, no matter how painful. And the third is taking compassionate action, which speaks for itself, but also is not as simple as it seems. In the poem by Rumi that John read, Rumi says, "Friends, be careful. Don't come near me out of curiosity or sympathy." And I feel like Rumi is saying, don't come to me with your preconceptions. I had so many visits where I had to confront the stereotypes that I carried and, frankly, my own spiritual laziness. But from that practice, I've come to learn that being ready to be surprised is a wonderful way to encounter the world. Being ready to be surprised. It's a hard posture, but it's so rewarding. The act of deep listening gives us surprising lessons, and some of them are hard. Once I was working in the emergency room, and I came upon a young woman who was waiting to be seen. So this particular ER was always busy, and people are often placed on gurneys in the hallway, surrounded by other people on gurneys, all of them waiting. This young woman was in obvious pain, writhing and groaning and sobbing. I tried to engage her a little, and as she grimaced, she indulged me with some short answers. I went to check on our nurse and find out if there's something I could do, but nurses were busy, and I knew better than to press them. And I went back to the woman, and I asked if I could sit with her while she waited. And she continued to groan and sob as I made some pointless chatter. Eventually, she said to me, crying, "I'm walking out. They're not going to help me here." I tried to talk her out of it. I said she'd just end up in another emergency room waiting again. She wouldn't hear it. She was done. And she left. And I was shaken by that encounter. And I had to accept a hard lesson in that moment. Sometimes we have no idea if our listening helps. Sometimes it sure seems like a ministry of futility. And I wish I could put a happy end on the story and say something that I did that day ended up making a big difference, but that would be a lie. Comfortable, but a lie. The real lesson is figuring out how to keep going when the reason we're doing the listening is not clear. That keeping going is an act of faith. I have faith in the practice of listening. I believe in it. And I'm going to keep doing it even when it's hard to see the point. So while I'm cheerleading for the practice of deep listening here, I want to take a moment to talk about an exception to the rule. There are times when we're under no obligation to listen to a person. Being willing to listen doesn't mean that we don't have any personal boundaries. So for the record, no one is obligated to listen to hateful speech or to sit and endure comments from people who would tear us down or tear down the people that we love. That's not listening, that's taking abuse. And it's funny, one of the weird things about the moment we're living in, this incredibly weird moment, and at least weird to me, the folks who think that the problem with our times is that we're too divisive, that the conversations aren't civil enough. And I'll tell you what, and it's only like somehow like these conversations are to blame. And I'll be honest, I do see conversations that are divisive or uncivil. And usually that's because someone is being openly bigoted or self-serving. You don't have to listen to that. That is the exception. Mostly listening is a beautiful practice. In my Unitarian Universalist theology, I think we conjure the holy through our relationships. When we connect with each other with integrity, and the Lord knows I fail at that all the time, but when we connect with integrity, we create something positive that wasn't there before. I think we bring the holy into being. I want to finish here by going back to my story about the woman who tried to convert me while her father was making a reckless decision about his health. So after that visit, I knew I needed a break, so I went back to the chaplain's office. And fortunately, there was a wise senior chaplain there, and I explained to her what just happened, and she was very understanding. Big surprise, right? She's a chaplain. But then she shared a thought that caught me off guard. In her gentle way, she suggested that maybe in my anger I had missed something. She suggested that the woman's overly aggressive attempt to convert me was actually an expression of the anxiety that she was feeling about the decision that she had just helped her father make. Perhaps she needed then, in that moment, to double down on the faith, just as she was making a dangerous bet on it. And I think my chaplain friend was right about that, and I missed it because I was too caught up in what I was feeling. The lesson for me was I needed to listen to the pain behind the daughter's words. I know that woman cared about her father. It wasn't about me. My prayer for us as listeners is that we be self-aware as we listen, that we watch for the preconceptions that we bring into our conversations, and that we have faith in deep listening as a way of being. My prayer is that through our listening, through our connections, we will conjure the holy. May it be so, and blessed be.